All right, so I'm going to try and remember to look into the camera. I know I'm going to be looking at my notes every now and then, so you might see me breaking eye contact occasionally, but I'll try and look into the camera so it's a little bit more natural. We're going to start with this presentation on the issue of uncertainty. Now, if we're all honest with ourselves, we know that having faith is a challenge, especially these days in the modern world. We have many challenges to our faith, and it's important to strip back our faith and have a look at the foundation, see what we actually believe, why we believe it, and indeed look at the issue of faith itself. I think this is particularly important because these days faith is typically characterized, or I would rather say mischaracterized, as a kind of a blind acceptance of dogma, which of course is exactly the opposite of what anybody should base a credible faith on. So we're going to start by looking at definitions of faith. In particular, we're going to look at what biblical faith is. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. Biblical faith is not blind faith, as we'll see in a minute. Then we'll look at the question of whether faith is rational, and we'll look at that from the secular perspective as well, because typically secular people always anticipate and expect that faith is necessarily irrational, but we're going to see that that's not true. Thirdly, we're going to look at the importance of and ways of testing our faith. And I think that's particularly important when we consider preaching, because by definition, when we're preaching, we're talking to people who don't believe the same as we do. And we need to find sound, solid, and evidence-based reasons for their belief in order to change their minds. So let's have a look at basic definitions of belief. So we're starting with the dictionary definition here. One definition, of course, is complete trust or confidence in anything, obviously. And then the second one is strong belief in a religion based on spiritual conviction rather than proof. Now, you've seen I've highlighted the words rather than proof, and that's an important distinction. Rather than proof is different to saying rather than evidence. Faith should be based on evidence, even though it may not be based on proof. Of course, faith is belief in the absence of definitive proof, but it is not belief in the absence of evidence. Belief in the absence of evidence is what's referred to as blind faith. And it's important to note that the word blind there is used specifically as a qualifier because faith by itself does not mean belief without evidence. So there are two basic positions here in terms of faith. One is called fideism. This is a kind of faith which is not based on evidence. Fideism is from the Latin word which literally means to believe. And fideism is a belief in the absence of evidence, believing something despite the fact that there is no evidence. Sometimes, in fact, even regardless of the fact that there may be evidence against your belief. Evidentialism, on the other hand, is a faith which is based on evidence. Not proof, because if you had proof, it wouldn't be faith, but on evidence. And I'm going to demonstrate with just a few quotations that biblical faith is evidentialist, not fideist. Now, I'll just give you a few examples here, and there are many more examples which I could provide, some of which you will know. When the Bible speaks to us, it continually and repeatedly appeals to evidence. In fact, we find this in the biblical records themselves. It might be interesting for us to recognize that so many of the Bible books actually seek to validate themselves by appealing to evidence. And we might think, well, hey, didn't like the Israelites know, or the Hebrews know that these books came from God? Well, they did, but nevertheless, these books nevertheless appeal to third-party external evidence. Look at Deuteronomy 3:11, when it's talking about the conquest of Og, king of Bashan, speaks of his sarcophagus of iron. Does it not indeed still remain in Rabbath of the Ammonites? So it's appealing to the historicity of Og of Bashan and his defeat, saying, look, you can go and see his sarcophagus. His dead body's still there. You can go and see it yourself. Go to Rabbath of the Ammonites. You can see it's right there. Likewise, in John 3:11, it appeals to eyewitness testimony. We speak about what we know and testify about what we have seen. In his preaching as well, of course, Paul says, we are witnesses of the events of which he's describing, particularly the events concerning Jesus' resurrection. And of course, there are many other examples, especially a surprising number of examples in the Old Testament. So it's very interesting to see, I think very important to see, that even when the Bible is speaking to believers, it still appeals to evidence. And that's a very important principle. Biblical faith is based on evidence. It is not fideism, it is evidentialist. It is not blind faith. And I think it's very important to realize that the earliest Christadelphians actually taught this. We're going to have a look now at some quotations from Brother Robert's book, The Visible Hand of God. And I think it's one of his best works. Definitely should be read by modern Christadelphians today. The Visible Hand of God was Robert's attempt to provide an evidence-based faith, not just for Christadelphians, but also for people who are investigating Christianity. And as I said, I think it's one of his best works. Let's look at what he says about faith in that book. Faith is confidence for a reason. Now, that's a fantastic snapshot of evidence-based faith right there. Then look at what he says. There is no truth in the popular view that places faith outside the confines of reason. So there he's explicitly rejecting fideism. Faith is not irrational. It is not belief without evidence. It is not belief separated from reason. It is confidence for a reason. When he was objecting to criticisms of Christadelphians and Christadelphian belief, note what he says. We believe this and that the Bible teaches thus and so. And then he says, both of these propositions are topics of investigation. And the man accepting them as true and acting them out in his life is not justly chargeable with fanaticism. So he was defending the charge that Christadelphians were just another crazy sect of people believing whatever on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, and that this was just another bunch of crazy fanatics. For him, the Christadelphian faith was based on evidence. It was not blind faith, and it could be investigated. Look what good he says in the next part of this article. It is not the blind faith of a fanatic that impels him, but the resolution of a sane man who acts from the perception of the facts. So for Robert Roberts, faith was based on facts. Not necessarily proof, of course, otherwise it wouldn't be faith, but definitely on facts. It's an evidence-based faith, not a blind faith. Evidentialism, not fideism. Likewise, in another article, when he's referring to the Jewish exiles who returned to Israel after the Babylonian captivity, he says it required a robust faith to undertake a journey of 4 months. But he says theirs was not a blind faith. And he goes on to say, God would not be pleased with such. So it's absolutely explicit there. Brother Roberts is telling us that not only is biblical faith evidentialist, but he also says that God would not be pleased with blind faith. And I think that's very important. We might have a look at, for example, examples in the Bible which seem to suggest blind faith. And one of the classic examples is Abraham and Isaac. And we might look at that and say, well, it looks like Abraham was prepared to kill Isaac just on the basis of God telling him so, and just somehow hoping that things would work out well. But of course, in Hebrews, the commentary on this is that Abraham had faith that God would raise up Isaac, because he knew that God had already worked in his life to preserve Isaac, to bring him into being, and that God had promised him that Isaac would be the promised seed. So Abraham's belief, even in that instance, was evidentialist. It was based on evidence. And of course, it's good to see that even later in the Christadelphian and in more recent years, this commentary, this concept of evidentialist-based faith is still alive and well. So Brother Creswell, I think that's Brother Paul Creswell, in 2000 in the Christadelphian magazine says, but Bible faith is not blind faith. He goes on to say, we are given more than sufficient evidence to prove that Christ was raised from the tomb. And that's the point, isn't it? When we look at the gospel records and we look at the preaching in Acts, what do they appeal to? They appeal to the empty tomb. They appeal to the absence of the body. They appeal to eyewitness testimony. And when they preach, the apostles use this evidence to demonstrate that Jesus has been raised. They don't just say, well, this is something we think is very true. We don't have any evidence, but we think it's true, and therefore you should think it's true as well. They appeal to witnesses, they appeal to evidence. And of course, even the gospel writers themselves note corroborating evidence, such as the cover-up which the temple priests were forced to take part in order to try and conceal the fact that Jesus' body had gone. So Bible faith is evidentialist. It's not a blind faith. Now, there's another letter here, 1984. I thought this was a very interesting one. A brother Draper, a letter to the editor saying that Christadelphians have a faith which is based on evidence and it is not blind. And look what he says here. In other words, we rightly endeavor, as the early brethren did, to find the real meaning behind the English words we read, and so come to the true message of God for man. And that has always characterized the Christadelphian approach. As we know in our preaching and discussions with other Christians, we get a lot of them saying, well, you know, it says right there in the Bible, it says the word hell, it says the word soul. Look, there's the word devil there. And we explain to them, look, yes, we know that that's what the English translation says, at least the English translation you're using there. But that's not enough. We need to dig deeper. We need to look back at the actual evidence. We need to go to those Hebrew and Greek words, see what the original meanings are. We need to look at them in their historical context. We need to use these commentaries, which tell us what people understood these words to mean at that time. And therefore, as we demonstrate, our faith is based on evidence. We don't just read the English text and base our beliefs on what we think it might mean. Now, look at what Draper says, continuing. Note that he's writing on the topic of fundamentalism. And the issue at the time being discussed in the Christadelphian was, are Christadelphians fundamentalists? Now, generally, I would say, I have to acknowledge this, generally, I think our community is broadly fundamentalist. And I have to also acknowledge, I think that's a bad thing, because I think fundamentalism is not a sound position, not a biblical position. But Brother Draper was very right in saying that our early community, at least in the way our community was founded originally, was not fundamentalist, and Christadelphians should not be fundamentalists. And look at what he says in this next quotation. He says, this approach of digging deep and basing our faith on evidence, this approach marks us as distinct from fundamentalists. He goes on to say, it has, I believe, always commended itself to people of reason who are not prepared to follow a blind faith. And as we can see, we can trace that all the way back to Brother Roberts and his early preaching work and his discussion of whether a biblical faith is blind or evidentialist. And of course, his complete rejection of fideism and his foundation of faith on evidence. So now let's look at the topic of the rationality of faith. And again, as I mentioned previously, this is a topic which we often have challenged when we're in discussion with secular people. And it's naturally assumed that the foundation or basic secular position is that faith is not rational. So let's have a look at what scholarly commentary says on the basis of faith. Now, before we start, of course, we know that blind faith is definitely irrational by definition. Faith on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, regardless of proof, is simply not rational. But as we can see, faith doesn't simply mean blind faith. So let's see what secular commentary says about faith. So in this particular article, Religion, Science and Rationality, in a scholarly journal, these authors spent a lot of time reviewing the scholarly literature and investigating the concept of faith and different definitions of faith. And they said that these findings challenge the received wisdom that religious beliefs and behavior are grounded in primitive, pre-scientific and non-rational thinking. And I can give you this article if you'd like to view it later. I'll send it to Dan if you'd like to look it up. It's very useful to look at and see how secular commentary and secular scholars investigate the issue of faith and indeed the concept of religious belief, and find that actually it can have, not always does, but can have a sound rational basis. And this is something that I think we need to be really careful of. If we want to preach to people, especially in this increasingly secular age, we should be approaching them on the basis of evidence. Again, in this article from a book, Hermeneutical Phenomenological Accounting for Faith, is faith rational? The certainty of and trust in the Christian faith cannot be made hard in a scientific, deductive, or inductive way. In other words, we can't have proof. But neither is it based on arbitrary opinion. We don't just open the Bible and decide it means whatever we think it is. As you'll see from reading good books on hermeneutics, the principles of understanding the Bible, when we interpret the Bible, we do so according to principles. We do so according to rules. We can't just open the Bible and make it say whatever we want. Faith is not arbitrary any more than it is blind. Likewise, in this other book on the concepts of philosophy of religion, the view that religious belief is irrational, or in some versions irrational, has never been the dominant position. And dominant position there means the dominant position in mainstream scholarship, particularly on the philosophy of religion. So we can see that there is clear evidence that in secular commentary, especially on the concept of the rationality of faith, that faith is by itself not considered intrinsically blind, not intrinsically irrational, as long as it is evidentialist, as long as it is predicated and based on evidence. And I think, as we've demonstrated, biblical faith is not irrational, it is not blind, it is not fideist, it is based on evidence. This, therefore, gives us a solid ground for being confident about what we believe, and not just that, but a solid ground for approaching other people in order to preach to them. But we must preach with evidence. So, how do we preach? This comes to the question of testing our faith. And as I'm sure we'll all be well aware, preaching is a test of our faith. It's a test of the confidence that we have in our own beliefs, and it's a test of our faith insofar as when we engage people in a discussion of our beliefs, we know we're going to get some pushback. We know we're going to get people challenging us to convince them, and challenging us, of course, to provide them with evidence. I'm going to quote now from a 19th century book on prophecy, and I'm doing so because this particular 19th century theologian, or clergyman possibly was explaining how difficult it is to preach in the absence of evidence. And he was opposing the fideist approach that he knew was very common in his day. Now, one of the reasons why he was doing this was because he was explaining how Bible prophecy is an extremely valuable tool for preaching. And the point he was making is that when we preach to other people, especially when we preach to non-Christians, we can get a lot of pushback if we don't provide them with clear reasons for our belief. And not just clear reasons, but something distinctive. Now let's look at what he says. He says, it is utterly useless for a Christian missionary to ask a native of that country, and he, of course, he's speaking of India at this time, whether Parsi, that's a Persian, Mohammedan or Hindu, a man as well educated as himself, to believe in the Bible because the missionary feels it to be true. So he says, you can't just go to these people and expect them to believe in the Bible just because you think it's true. He goes on to say, the native naturally replies, I have as much inward faith in the truth of my Bible as you have in yours. My religion, in two of the cases, is much older than yours. My book was believed in by thousands, many centuries before yours was thought of. So he says, look, you can't just go to people and say, look, it's in the Bible. I believe it. You should believe it too. People are going to say, well, I've got a Bible too. Mine's actually older. Mine's was believed for thousands of years. And plenty of people believe in my Bible as well. What reason can you give me for believing in your Bible rather than believing in mine? You need some kind of external witness. You need some kind of external demonstration that the Bible is more credible. And of course, Baker's point was that Bible prophecy gives us that tool. And as much as I think that Bible prophecy has sadly fallen into disrepute in our community through gross mishandling of the interpretations, and of course through repeated ridiculous predictions which have repeatedly failed, I still believe that Bible prophecy is Bible's own declaration, a clear demonstration of the divine origin of the Bible, and more than that, a clear demonstration of the existence of God, and not just any God, but our God, the specific God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Jesus himself and the apostles. Baker goes on to say, speaking of this native, speaking of this Indian, unless you can give me some far more convincing proof of the truth of your book than your own feelings and the internal evidence, as you call it, of the Gospels, I cannot consent to desert the religion I have up till now believed to be true. Now, note that Baker is aware that mere internal consistency is also not sufficiently convincing. He's dealing with educated, intelligent people here. And I think Baker's kind of way ahead of his time here. He's saying, you know, you can't just treat these people as uneducated, primitive savages. These are intelligent people, just like you and me, and they have their own beliefs, and they believe them for certain reasons. You need to overcome those reasons, and you can't just treat them as people who believe things just because you told them to. And look at that. He knows that even if you say, look at the Bible, and look at all these cross references, look how consistent the gospel records are with each other. And frankly, that's a topic for another time, because as we know, there are many inconsistencies in the gospel records, and we know there are reasons why there are inconsistencies, but we do need to acknowledge that they are there. But internal consistency of itself is not a demonstration of the divine origin or even of the accuracy of a book. So Baker was very well aware that appealing simply to the authority of the book on the basis of the authority of an individual's personal belief in it, or even appealing to the authority of the Bible on the basis of its own internal consistency, is insufficient to warrant belief. And of course, he said you need to find something external. You need something which you have to demonstrate that the Bible has knowledge which no other book has. The Bible validates itself by evidence outside the Bible. And we know, as we've seen from those quotations earlier, that the Bible books do that, that the Gospels themselves do that, that the apostles did that in their own preaching. They validated their preaching, they validated their teaching, and the Bible books validate themselves by an appeal to external evidence. So we have actually in the early issues of the Christadelphians writing and doing exactly this. For example, the Anglo-Israel controversy, which to us might seem quite ridiculous, but in the 19th century was a really big deal. And in fact, there was a huge Christian movement teaching that the British people were some of the lost tribes of Israel, and they were actually Hebrews. And that movement is still around today, and it's bigger than us, I might mention. So as we can see, this particular article in the Christadelphian magazine in the 19th century was arguing against the idea of British Israelitism. Now, note what it does here. It doesn't say, well, you know, the Bible never says this. It doesn't say, well, the Bible says X, so this is obviously true. What does it say? The first and chief step must be to establish a historical connection between the Anglo-Saxon race and the lost tribes. And unless this can be satisfactorily accomplished, all the texts in the Bible, however plausible they may seem, will not serve to establish the theory. So the author of this article is rightly saying it's not good enough to just throw around a few Bible verses and say, well, this is what they mean. This proves that the British people are the lost tribes of Israel. You need evidence outside the Bible in order to validate your beliefs about the Bible. And I think this is a very important principle, and in fact, a principle that modern Christadelphians have somewhat lost sight of. If we're going to teach people about the Bible, if we're going to convince them that our interpretation of the Bible is correct, we need to follow the rules. We need to establish our understanding of the Bible's interpretation using evidence outside the Bible. Here's another example, of course, the Book of Mormon challenged by Christadelphians. And how did Christadelphians challenge the authority of the Book of Mormon? Well, not simply by quoting Bible verses, because they know that's not enough. Instead, this brother says, competent modern scholars who are authorities in the field of hieroglyphics make it plain that this claim, that is, that the Book of Mormon was translated from some apparent book or scroll of Egyptian hieroglyphics, has no foundation in fact. And look at that. This is an appeal to an external witness. Not only that, this is an appeal to an authority. It's an appeal to a legitimate authority, not a false appeal to authority. This is an appeal to competent scholarship, and that's a very important point. I think it's a very legitimate point that where somebody is making a claim which is testable by experts, then obviously it's legitimate to test that claim. And if their claim is contradicted by the experts, they need a reason to validate their claim. They need some evidence to provide. They need to provide some evidence to demonstrate that the experts are wrong. Now we come to the issue of credibility. As we know, these days our faith is under fire from many different quarters, and it's difficult sometimes to find the confidence to preach when we feel that our belief itself is not credible. Now, if it is not credible to us, it is definitely not going to be credible to other people. And by the same token, the fact that our faith is not found credible by many people also can erode our own confidence in our faith and make it seem less credible to ourselves. In particular, of course, in recent years, there has been the rise of what has been termed the new atheism, a movement taking particular aim at religious belief and, of course, mainly at Christianity, which has caused some of members of our community a considerable amount of disquiet. So in this section on credibility, we're going to look at the new atheism. Firstly, we're going to look at what the new atheism is, or rather I should say what it was, and I'll explain that in a minute. Secondly, we'll look at secular scholarly criticisms of new atheism, that is, criticisms of new atheism from within the secular and atheist community itself. Then we'll look at the very interesting concept of why atheists have been copying religious people. Firstly, what is or what was the new atheism? The new atheism was described in this way. The basic tenets of the new atheism are firstly that science and religion are incompatible. Secondly, that there are no supernatural causes for anything. Thirdly, that science is a reliable guide to morality. Fourthly, that religion is dangerous or useless. And fifthly, that religion must be eradicated. And this is why this was referred to as the new atheism. Obviously, there is nothing new in atheism itself. It goes back centuries, even arguably a couple of thousand years. However, this new atheism was different insofar as it was at least a semi-organized movement which held these specific tenets in common. And this was definitely a new movement in atheism. Prominent atheist spokesmen included a number of, sorry, I've missed a slide there, a number of scholars and scientists. Richard Dawkins was one of the most outspoken proponents. Victor Stenger was a physicist who was also outspoken. Sam Harris, a humanist. And Christopher Hitchens, a social and cultural commentator, and also kind of a backyard philosopher. It's important, however, to note that atheists, just like religious people, can also be irrational. And not all of the beliefs of the new atheists were actually founded on proof or even on evidence. Some of the new atheists, for example, Bill Maher is still solidly preaching against Western medicine. For some reason, he has the idea that Western medicine is wrong, and he has some weird mystical beliefs. In Plimer, geologists who is famous for making attempts to debunk young Earth creationists, also has tried to debunk the concept of anthropogenic global warming. He's a climate change denier. Penn and Teller, two outspoken secularists and atheists, have been tobacco apologists. It's a position they've backed away from in recent years, but as they are libertarians, they have been in the past actively campaigning on behalf of tobacco companies, trying to argue that they shouldn't be regulated and that cigarette smoking isn't as harmful as scientists say. Richard Dawkins, of course, has a number of irrational beliefs, among them that the claim that religion is useless, for which he has been criticized by many secular scholars. So now let's have a look at criticism of new atheism from secular scholars and, in fact, also atheist and humanist commentary. A number of secular scholars, some of them very prominent in the atheist world, have criticized the new atheism from a range of positions. Jonathan Haidt has criticized new atheist attitudes to religion and their understanding of moral psychology, which is a particular area in which Haidt is experienced. He says new atheist attitudes to religion are unsophisticated and do not understand how religion works and its social benefits. And he has said that their understanding of moral philosophy is wildly inaccurate. Michael Ruse is a highly prominent philosopher of religion, an atheist himself, but has objected that the dogmatic and schismatic behavior of new atheists actually gives them the appearance of religious believers. And he argues that a lot of new atheists don't actually base their arguments on evidence, and in fact that they are indulging in a blind faith as much as the people they are criticizing. Massimo Pigliucci is an Italian philosopher who's very engaged in the new atheism, and not part of it, though he is an atheist. He's a staunch critic of the new atheism and has objected to it from a number of points of view. He objects that the new atheism attempts to apply science to problems that it cannot solve, problems it was never designed to solve, for example, like ethics and morality. He's criticized Richard Dawkins' claims about religion and Dawkins' theory of memes, and he's criticized Harris' claim that Sam Harris's claim that science can determine morality reliably and accurately. Massimo is a very good commentator on the new atheism, and I strongly recommend his articles if you're interested in following up criticism of new atheism. Jacques Bellina-Blau is a French philosopher, secular and of course atheist philosopher, who wrote an excellent book, which I will quote later, criticizing atheist criticism of religion. He has criticized new atheists for being biblically illiterate and failing to appreciate the sophistication of Christian apologetics, which I'll come to later, and also failing to appreciate the benefits of religion. Alain de Botton is another secular humanist who has criticized new atheists for failing to acknowledge the benefits of religion and has openly advocated that atheists should copy religious people in order to try and benefit from the principles of religion without following religion itself. Finally, Whitley Kaufman is a prominent philosopher who has commented that, as far as he is concerned, and as he says, as many commentators have said, the new atheists have contributed little, if anything, to the debate from an intellectual or scholarly perspective. And again, I can give you some articles of his to follow up, including the one I've quoted from now. So let's have a look at some specific criticisms of the new atheism, starting with Jacques Bellina-Blau, who I've cited earlier. Bellina-Blau says that the new atheism is ignorant. He says, in all but exceptional cases, today's secularists are biblically illiterate. Truth be told, their repertoire of knowledge about religion in general leaves much to be desired. But of course, as he said, their knowledge of the Bible in particular is especially poor. And Bellina-Blau is not saying this because he's trying to defend the Bible. On the contrary, he's concerned that atheists are shooting themselves in the foot by making attacks on the Bible which are misguided because they are uninformed. And he makes the point that, look, these days, Christians are much more sophisticated than you would think. And he says, contrary to what so many 19th century and 20th century social theorists believed and hoped for, the species, that is Christians, has not abandoned its faith in the divine. Karl Marx's optimism about the impending abolishment of religion was unfounded. The masses have not turned away from their beliefs with the fatal inevitability of a process of growth, as Sigmund Freud predicted. And no, the gods are not growing old or dying, to invoke Emil Durkheim's famous words. Bellina-Blau says, believing intellectuals, in contrast, are thriving once again. Note that he says believing intellectuals, because Bellina-Blau is well aware that these days intellectuals are convinced of religion as much as lesser educated people. Speaking specifically of modern Christian apologists, he says they now draw skillfully on the full range of sciences, social sciences, and humanities to provide evidence for their beliefs. And you note, of course, that the title of his book, The Secular Bible, is Why Non-Believers Must Take Religion Seriously. And he says they must take it seriously for two reasons. Firstly, because they underestimate the evidence on which it's based and the sophistication of religious and particularly Christian apologetics. And secondly, because religious belief has much to teach atheists and non-religious people. So then he goes on, speaking of Christian apologists. In doing so, their proofs for the existence of God and the importance of belief, ritual, communities of the faithful, and so on, have become increasingly rigorous and coherent. Now, if you read this section of Belinda Blau's book, you'll find that what he's saying is, look, Christians are getting better at this, and atheists are not catching up. They are actually ahead of us in terms of basing their faith on evidence and making more sophisticated and stronger arguments for their faith. I think that's a very important acknowledgement. Now, I mentioned previously the idea of speaking about the new atheism in the past. I referred to it a couple of times in the past tense, and I'm going to explain why. The new atheism was very prominent, say, in the first decade of the 21st century, and then something happened later on. I don't know why that crosses there. I'm not sure what that, not sure why that crosses there. Let's have a look at what's going on. Where's my sharing?
I think it's an annotation. If you go up to annotations in the menu, you can clear them.
Okay, where are my annotations?
Although the host might have to do it. So we might need Dan.
Oh, okay.
Where it says a few options and then click on annotate. It's been there for half an hour.
I'm going to try that and find out if it's a not sure if it's an, I don't think it's a, is it a Zoom annotation or is it a Microsoft annotation?
Looks like a Zoom one.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I'm not sure how it's appeared. We might have to live with it. If I mean, I can't delete it. Dan, are you able to remove that? Yeah, I don't think it's at my end, at least not from here. I know I didn't touch anything, so I'm not sure why it's here.
John Fry had one earlier. He had a smiley face on.
Right, yeah, and then there's some, yeah, okay, great. Thanks a lot for that. Cool. Okay, let's go back up and have a look at what happened to the new atheism. So as I said previously, in the first decade of the 21st century, the new atheism was gaining ground. It was quite the thing. Then something started to happen in the second decade of the 21st century, and this is why now people speak of the new atheism in the past tense. The fact is that the new atheism didn't bring anything new. In fact, as we've seen, it had quite a collection of tenets, and as these tenets came under criticism, it was demonstrable that they were way overplaying their hand. It was difficult even to sustain a couple of these claims, and to sustain all of them together, which is what defined the new atheism, became impossible. So in the second half of the, second decade, I should say, the 21st century, the new atheism started to die, and we started to see headlines like this. In 2015, is the new atheism dead? In 2017, the death of new atheism. In 2019, and this is The Guardian, which is by no means a religiously friendly publication, the Four Horsemen Review, whatever happened to new atheism? By now, people were speaking of it as dead and gone. William Briggs, in February 2019, on the death of new atheism and what became of it. And again, at the end of 2019, very recently, the strange death of the new atheism. As I mentioned previously, the new atheism massively overplayed its hand. The point was that the tenets of the new atheism and its dogmatism, and in fact, ironically, its lack of evidence, brought it down. It couldn't sustain its belief, and in particular, it couldn't sustain the specific combination of beliefs which it was presenting. And it's ironic to acknowledge the fact that the new atheism failed because of lack of evidence. Quite a warning, I think, for ourselves. So now let's go on to the third point in this section. I think this is a particularly important point: why atheists copy religious people. The benefits of religious belief have been very well documented for decades in scholarly literature. They include increased levels of education, lower crime rates, higher rates of civil involvement, and higher levels of cooperation. And this is even after controlling for confounding factors. Lower divorce rates, higher marital satisfaction, better outcomes for children and youth, and health and longevity benefits. Let's have a look now at some of the recent scholarly literature. Many studies have documented the benefits of religious involvement. Indeed, highly religious people, and note that highly religious people tend to be healthier, live longer, and have higher levels of subjective well-being. It's important to note, and I can give you the citations later, that the benefits that accrue to religious belief accrue predominantly for people with strong religious belief who are highly involved in their communities. People with weaker religious belief who are less involved do not receive these benefits. And in fact, it has been demonstrated that people who are significantly unengaged in their religious communities and who exhibit lower religious belief can in fact have even worse outcomes than people who do not believe in anything. And basically the idea here is you can only get the benefits of religious belief if you have a strong religious belief and you're actively involved in your community. There are no half measures here. You can't fake it. You can't be a little bit religious and still get the benefits. Okay, it's just like being a little bit pregnant. You can't be half in and half out and still gain the benefits of religious belief. And of course, we know that the Bible is very clear on this itself. All those warnings about being lukewarm, not just in the terms of the religious, the phrase from Revelation, but many other admonitions in the Bible about the importance of firm, strong, and wholehearted belief. James, quotation in James 1 comes to mind about being double-minded. Many other quotations in the Bible about the importance of a firm, strong, wholehearted belief, and particularly a strong and dedicated involvement in the community. Religious participation has also been associated with better educational outcomes. Again, several studies have documented an association between religion and children's well-being. Again, another quotation here from an article, The Role of Religious and Social Organizations in the Lives of Disadvantaged Youth. Overall, we find strong evidence that youth with religiously active parents are less affected later in life by a childhood disadvantage than youth whose parents did not, note this, frequently attend religious services. So the point is that the strongly religious people who are actively involved in their religious community have better benefits for their children, even when their children are already suffering from disadvantage, social and socioeconomic disadvantage from other factors. Note that religiously active parents and frequently attend religious services because they gain support, emotional, spiritual, and of course, material support from that community involvement. Now, note what they say next. We generally find much weaker buffering effects for other social organizations. That's very important because, yes, there are other organizations, non-government organizations, social welfare organizations, charities, which are trying to help these disadvantaged people. But their buffering effect, their benefits accrue much less. They provide lower benefits than religious organizations. So religious organizations do a better job, even of secular organizations specifically aimed at trying to help these people. And this is one of the reasons why, as I've noticed, atheists have started to copy religious people. Again, another article, Who Benefits from Religion, the one I cited previously. Several studies show that religious involvement, note that religious involvement is generally associated with health promoting behaviors, and that such behaviors explain in part the connection between religion and longevity. Again, Jonathan Haidt, who I cited earlier, surveys have long showed that religious believers in the United States are happier, healthier, long-lived, and more generous to charity and to each other than are secular people. Most of these effects have been documented in Europe too. And that is across the socio-economic spectrum. It's not just the rich people. It's not the well-off people. It's not just the people in the higher socio-economic strata. It's the people right across the strata of socio-economic welfare. So Haidt says, if you believe that morality is about happiness and suffering, then I think you are obligated to take a close look at the way religious people actually live and ask what they are doing right. Now, remember, that's Jonathan Haidt, a secularist. He's an atheist, but he's commenting on the importance of religious belief in the role of the believer and the community. I got a quote now from an early convert to Christianity in the 2nd century. A man called Aristides the Athenian, who wrote an apology for Christianity to the emperor, defending Christianity against false claims by other Romans, and who explained his personal reasons for converting to Christianity. And I think this is incredibly revealing because it gives us a special insight, a rare insight into why those early pagan converts changed their religion to Christianity. He noted a distinct difference between pagan beliefs and Christian beliefs. Let's look at a summary of what he said. Paganism worships the creation. Christianity worships the creator, which, as he said, makes a lot more sense. Paganism practices infanticide, which was standard practice in Greek and Roman society. Christianity forbids infanticide. Paganism disregards the poor, and as surprising as it may seem, you can find many quotations from famous philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato and Socrates saying, look, it doesn't really matter about the poor. You can disregard the poor, whereas Christianity cares for the poor. Paganism disregards the weak. Christianity cares for the weak. The gods of the pagans can die. The God of the Christians cannot die. Paganism has many small gods all doing their various different functions. It's quite a mess. And of course, you have the concept of theomachia, the war of the gods. But Christianity has only one great God who brings the entire cosmos under their control. In paganism, the gods tease humans. In Christianity, God pities humans. In paganism, the gods are made from nature. But in Christianity, God is above nature, which he created. Paganism worships idols as God. Christianity rejects idols. Paganism justifies human vice. And of course, the Greek and Roman gods are famous for indulging in the same vices of humanity and being as capricious and as mean and nasty and vicious as the humans who they control. Whereas Christianity condemns human vice and therefore gives people an extrinsic reason for bettering themselves, an extrinsic reason for moral improvement. Of course, this connects with the next concept. In paganism, there is no necessity for moral change, whereas Christianity requires moral change. Consequently, as Aristides astutely demonstrated, paganism produces an immoral life, whereas Christianity produces a moral life. I think this is extremely important because we can see this is an example of a pagan giving their own reasons for why they converted to Christianity. And he is using the same kind of arguments that secular and atheist commentaries have used for taking religion seriously in the current era. Now let's have a look also at some pagan commentary, pagan Roman commentary on Christianity in its earliest years. I'm going to quote now from the pagan poet Lucian, who hated Christianity. Lucian was a satirist. He wrote biting satirical commentary on, well, pretty much everything. He was a bit of a misanthrope. He criticized Roman society as much as anything else, but he wrote about Christians who he thought were frankly deluded, crazy people who were hopelessly naive, but he could not understand their moral position. Look at what he said. The earnestness with which the people of this religion help one another in their needs is incredible. they spare themselves nothing for this end. And he says their first lawgiver, and he's speaking of Jesus here, put it into their heads that they were all brethren. What a bizarre idea. Now let's look at the pagan Roman emperor Julian, referred to as Julian the Apostate or Julian the Heretic. Julian was brought up in the 4th century as a Christian in a Christian household. However, later, after he came to power, he, as it were, took off his false beard and moustache and said, surprise, I'm a pagan. I was a pagan all along. I was just pretending to be leaving Christianity. And what he tried to do was to roll back the Constantinian reforms and try to re-establish pagan religion and abolish Christianity. Now, he had a good chance of doing that, given the fact that Constantine's Christianizing of the pagan Roman Empire was, it must be acknowledged, fairly superficial. And even the later reforms of Theodosian in the 4th century after Constantine, which were much more influential and much more wide sweeping, could still be rolled back by an enthusiastic emperor. And Julian tried exactly to do that. He promoted the pagan religion. He persecuted the churches. He persecuted the Christians. He tried to turn people back to the old ways, the good old-fashioned faith of our fathers. Remove not the ancient landmarks, he'd said. Let's get back to the old stuff, those good old pagan gods that our fathers served. But he had a problem. His problem was it was extremely difficult to convince the lay people. Christians had a very good foothold, and Julian figured out why. Christianity had developed an extremely good reputation by doing good, whereas pagan religion, in contrast, as we've already seen from Aristides, had a serious image problem. As he says here, while pagan priests neglect the poor, the hated Galileans, that's his name for the Christians, are devoted to works of charity. And he goes on to say, it is shameful that our people, pagans, should be lacking our assistance. Julian rightly observed exactly what Aristides had noted. Pagan religion brought no moral change. Pagan religion did not require service to the poor. It wasn't actually involved in helping people. It wasn't making society better. And he said, you know what we need to do? We need to copy Christians. See their communal meals and their tables spread for the poor. Such practice is common among them and causes a contempt for our gods. Now, you can find Julian's entire writing online, and you will find that later on he urges the priests in as many words to copy the Christians. He says, do the same things that they are doing. Start saying good things about poor people. Start trying to encourage people to care for the poor. Give alms. Do charitable works. You've got to try and copy the things they're doing. You know, we're at war here. You've got to up your game. We need better marketing. You need to copy the Christians. Otherwise, it's all over. Well, as we know, Julian didn't win. His anti-pagan crusade was short-lived. Julian himself died in battle. You can read the works of Ammianus Marcellinus, a Romanized Greek, who is one of our best first-hand historians for the era, who served in Julian's armies, actually, and gives us some interesting insights into Julian's character. Of course, Ammianus himself was a pagan Greek who thought that Christianity was trash and that Julian was a great guy. And he gives us some interesting insights into Julian's character, as I said. But Julian failed because the pagans could not change their ways. It was too late to make paganism something it never was in the first place. Meanwhile, people could already see the material benefits of following Christianity. And the Christians had already well established themselves as credible because the benefits that they said accrued from their religion were obvious. Now, this is the kind of preaching that we really need to be getting into. This is the kind of preaching that the Bible tells us to do. We know from James 1 that this is what pure religion, true religion before God and the Father really is. And of course, Christ's own example gives us a clear example of why he was believed, because he did what he said. John the Baptist likewise. So this is what we should be focusing on. And this is why atheists are copying religion. Now let's have a look at Alain de Botton, the secular humanist I cited earlier. And I cited the fact that he wrote a book talking about why atheists should imitate Christians. His book was actually called Religion for Atheists, a non-believer's guide to the uses of religion. The error, he says, of modern atheism has been to overlook how many aspects of the faiths remain relevant even after their central tenets have been dismissed. He said, look, even if you strip away the supernatural beliefs that you don't like, you can't deny the fact that the stuff works. And there are important principles here that even if you don't believe in the religious stuff, we should try to copy. At least we could try to gain some benefit from the things that they are doing. He goes on to give specific examples. Religions have wisely insisted that we are inherently flawed creatures, incapable of lasting happiness, beset by troubling sexual desires, obsessed by status, vulnerable to appalling accidents, and always slowly dying. So he says, look, you know, unlike atheism, religion actually addresses the things that people care about. It understands people from the inside out. It addresses people at their fundamental needs, and it provides a framework for people to deal with their own selves. He goes on to say, consider by contrast how belatedly and how bluntly the modern state enters into our lives with its injunctions. It intervenes when it is already far too late, after we've picked up the gun, stolen the money, lied to the children, or pushed our spouse out of the window. His argument was that secular authorities and secular frameworks only intervene in the lives of the moral individual after things have gone wrong. There is nothing in secularism and atheism which actually guides people to a better or more moral life. Secular authorities are simply there as punishers or regulators of behavior after people have transgressed. Consequently, it is no surprise that following de Botton and other atheist commentators, secular people, atheists in particular, have tried to copy religious faith, not in its beliefs, more in the trappings. They've tried to take up the mantle of religion. They've tried to hold secular gatherings. They tried to do atheist church. Here's an example. It's a photo here of an atheist gathering, a Sunday gathering for atheists, secular people, and other non-believers. And as you can see, this would look out of place in most Christadelphian halls. Look at all the people there, quietly seated in front of the platform. Look, some of the women are even wearing hats. How very traditional of them. If you can see at the top, there's a rather hilarious phrase, "To thine own self be true." Okay, I think that's particularly hilarious because of the Old English used. It's like they're just old school Christadelphians. They still can't give up the good old fashioned KJV English. And what are they doing here? They're trying to get the benefits of religion without putting in the work. As I mentioned previously, and as we looked at those most scholarly citations I provided earlier, you don't get the benefits of religion simply by taking up the trappings. You can't dress as a religious person and get the benefits of religion. Religion is not something that you can put on. It's not something you can simply copy. And although in the early 21st century and in the second decade of the 21st century, many atheist organizations tried to do this. They tried to copy religion as they've been encouraged to do. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Let's have a look at this article from The Atlantic. And this is a very good article, which you should follow up. It's from last year, very recent. Look at the title. They tried to start a church without God. For a while, it worked. Now, note this. The article says, but even as the growth of nuns, that's people with no religion, has revved up in the intervening years, the growth of secular congregations hasn't kept pace. This was a really big thing a few years ago. There was quite a growth in these secular congregations or faithless churches, atheist churches. And for a while, there were thousands of people attending it. It was the biggest new thing, but something happened. They couldn't sustain the momentum. After a promising start, the article says, attendance declined and nearly half the chapters, that's the chapters of this particular group, churches, if you like, have fizzled out, including the New York one that Walford, the person who was interviewed, joined. Look at what it says next. Building a durable community of non-believers, it turns out, is more complicated than just excising God. Now, this is something that critics of the new atheism, and of course religious people themselves, have pointed out for a while. You don't build a community based on people not believing something. You don't build a community of successful people who have benefits in their personal lives on the basis of not believing things. There's no community of people who don't like golf or people who don't believe in Yetis, okay? There are no people who form a community based on not believing something who gain the benefits of people who do believe in something. The point is that these people imitated the trappings, the superficial realities of Christianity and religion. They thought they could just take up all the physical apportments, the mantle, as it were, of religion, Christianity in particular, and accrue the benefits. They thought that you could take up the external appearance without the inner moral change, without the moral authority, without the faith and the shared belief. And of course, they were wrong. They didn't understand, they still don't understand how religion works, how Christianity in particular works. It's all about the inner moral change, but nobody wants to do that. It's all about the faith in something bigger than you, but nobody wants that. The whole reason being an atheist was to get away from that, to be independent. You don't have anything bigger than you. There is no supernatural. There's no necessity for a moral change. Yes, you're supposed to be a good person, but nobody is giving you a regulation and saying you need to change yourself in this way. Look at what they decided. Look at what the article says. You need a very powerful, motivating element to keep people coming, something that attendees have in common, and they didn't have that. We do have that. That's the point of our regular memorial service. We have a very powerful, motivating element to keep people coming. We gather every Sunday and we remember the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord. We remember what he did for us, and it inspires us in the coming week to do the same for others. It inspires us to treat each other in the way that he treated us. It builds our community. It sustains our faith. It provides material benefits for our emotional, our spiritual, our physical well-being. It gives us a faith and a hope for things in the future. And it inspires us to try and make this world a better place, following the example of Jesus. This is why our faith is credible. This is why we should stand firm, regardless of the hostility of the external environment, regardless also of the hostility within our own community. Our faith is credible, and it's even more credible when we see atheists trying to copying it and failing. Because our faith is real, because it is based on reality. It's an evidence-based faith with demonstrable positive material outcomes and the truth of Jesus Christ and the example that he gave. Thanks for listening.